My name's Jordyn Holman. I am a board member for the New York Financial Writers Association, recently joined, which I'm really excited about. I'm also a business reporter at the New York Times, and I'm excited to interview my colleague Rob Copeland this evening. As you guys all know, since you're here, Rob is author of the fun Ray Dalio, Bridgewater Associates, and the Unraveling of a Wall Street Legend. So we will be discussing his book, the reporting, all of that. As a heads up, we will leave time for questions that you all can ask Rob. So just think of those questions as we, have this discussion. You can either drop it in the chat, you can raise your hand, whatnot. We'll get to those towards the end. And just as a reminder, mute yourself at this time, but when we get to questions, obviously, we'll do the unmute thing. All right, Rob, good to see you virtually.
I haven't seen you in days.
I'll see you in the office tomorrow, maybe. So I so enjoyed reading your book for several reasons. I personally did not know about all of Ray Dalio and his principles. So I was really reading it, like learning about him in a deep way for the first time. So where I wanted to start is obviously you've been covering hedge funds for I think more than a decade at this point. And I'm wondering, when did you what intrigued you initially about Ray Dalio, or was it Bridgewater that made you really say, I want to dive into this reporting?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And they don't make you say this because you know how to control yourself, but the Times likes for me to say at the start of anything that I don't speak for the New York Times, but I speak for myself. So that's a good preview. But I actually started writing about hedge funds and about I guess the world of finance more than 10 years ago. I joined a now sadly defunct trade publication called Absolute Return, and it was the hedge fund trade publication. So, it was sort of our job to know what Bridgewater was, and it was the world's biggest hedge fund. And, Ray Dalio was sort of known as an odd duck even then. But I don't think that the rest of the world had necessarily heard of him. So it wasn't until, say, about 2016, 2017, he comes out with his book and he does this huge media tour, and he really starts to create this alternate version of reality, this version of himself as this sort of benevolent business titan. And so when that happened, I just did the basics of reporting, and I kept talking to people, and it just kept getting crazier and crazier and crazier until the point that the stories that Ray was telling and is still telling about Bridgewater to this day, they were just so completely off base from what I was hearing from people that it was, as I like to say, in my mind, I wrote the first nonfiction book about Ray Dalio and Bridgewater.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get to that because I think narratives shape a big part of this reporting. So you were at the you started at the other publication, then a lot of this reporting was at the Wall Street Journal, obviously writing front page stories about Bridgewater and Ray Dalio. I'm wondering, at what point did you realize you had enough reporting and narrative to make that into a book, to really start pursuing book writing?
I don't think you ever fully know, frankly. I was just talking to Greg Zuckerman, who wrote a wonderful book about Jim Simons, who passed away. And Greg was saying that after Jim passed away last week, he was getting more anecdotes from people and saying, I wish I could have put them in the book. So there's sort of no ending. I think the real eerie moment for me when researching the book was I knew that we can talk about it, but that the principles and everything, that it wasn't all that Ray made it up to be. But I didn't realize how much of his origin story also had been both exaggerated and sort of obfuscated, and how much he had left out. So once I realized that, really from the very beginning, from decades before I was even born, that he had been sort of setting up this storyline, that's when it really started to feel to me like a complete book.
Right, because it's what we like as journalists, the tension,
Yeah.
the having to ask a lot of people things and uncovering something that's not already out there. So I'm curious, when it came to sourcing on this, how did the sourcing feel when you were approaching people saying, hey, I'm working on a story for the Wall Street Journal. It's like a news article versus, hey, I'm trying to go deeper. I'm really trying to write a book about it. Was there a difference?
It's a great question because there is a difference, but it wasn't necessarily what I was expecting. Because when you're working on a newspaper story, frankly, at the Journal or at the Times, I find as business reporters, there's not a colossal difference in sort of the bully pulpit. But when you're working on an article, you could say, you have 24 hours to get back, or this is going to be in the paper, or it's going to be read by, I mean, at the Journal, even 3 to 4 million people, 10 million people at the Times. In a book, you're sort of giving people, I was talking to people starting in 2020, and this book came out in November 2023. So everyone, people sort of, they want to see if you're actually going to do it. So many people just assume that Ray would find a way to kill the book or frankly kill me. And it was a joke. I don't think he's that violent. But the humor doesn't always translate on Zoom, guys. But towards the end of the book process, even 2 years in, I was still getting new people, new crazy things, and I was looping back to people who were reticent, and they were telling me new things. So it's just a really fun, different intellectual challenge. And you also have to remember, when we're weighing what is truth and what is not, the people who spoke to you at the very beginning, who helped shape your understanding of it with no threat, just out of wanting the true story to be told. I always find you do have to weigh that differently than someone who at the very last second, out of desperation, sent a lawyer at you with a list of responses.
So how did you weigh those different narratives? I'm wondering, like, was there a moment where someone came in on the 11th hour and did it like reshape, a part of like a passage in the book, or maybe wanting you to add a chapter? Like, how did that process work?
So it was very important to me from the beginning, and there are other books that have a different attitude about this, by the way, but I didn't want the book to be sort of a dialogue between me and Ray Dalio, or me and Bridgewater's many lawyers and many PR people, one of whom I'm sure is on this call somewhere, taking notes on what I'm saying. So I wanted you to have his perspective, but I wanted you to see not just him talking to me, but how he was telling his story to other people. I'm also very open that this is a nonfiction narrative. It is, I think, close to 110,000 words, but it's not a transcript. This book takes place over 50 years. So of course there are things left out of here. But just because it's not that does not mean that it's untrue. And frankly, it doesn't mean that, Ray's books or documentary or anything would be any less true.
So I want to talk about like the contents of the book, because the whole time I was reading, it was so engaging. Like, I carried the book everywhere with me, plane rides, on the subway. I was like telling friends about like this book because there's so many anecdotes. There's moments when I had to put the book down because it was like heart-wrenching, like just the description of how people were treated. So you have to walk me through, or walk us through this. Like, how did you know kind of where to start? Like, why focus on those human anecdotes? I believe the first few pages, someone is like throwing up over the decision to work there. So why lean in to kind of the people part of it compared to, hey, Bridgewater is a hedge fund, this is what they do?
Well, here's a behind the scenes for the people watching, by the way, which is that I brought Jordyn a book, and she had a copy of the book so she could read it, and she already had taken it out. It was at her desk, but I'd already inscribed it, so it was like, well, now she has two. Exactly. I've always thought that the great appeal of Bridgewater and of Ray is that Ray gets to pitch that he has these principles, and that it is it's sort of a self-improvement mantra, that one of his principles is pain plus reflection equals progress. And so he constantly talks in sort of these higher level terms about how if you follow this, you will be successful, and that they are critical to his success. And if I wanted to do one thing in the book, it was to reframe that story from, instead of telling a story just about how it looks to Ray Dalio, show how it looks to these other people, the people who are really being affected by it. and who he is, as they would say, many of them would say he was terrorizing them with it. But there's a difficulty there, which is that so many successful business books, nonfiction books, they fictionalize people's names. Even Bad Blood, great book, the gold standard in the last 10 years for a business book. Many of those names are fake. They're combinations of characters. They're composites. And I knew that I couldn't get away with that. I knew that he had too many lawyers, and I knew that he would string me up, and he would say that look, Rob admits to making things up. These people don't even exist. So what I wound up doing was, I left many people out of the book, but it was because I was searching for the real people, the real characters who I thought you could relate to the most. If I had my druthers, the book would be even wilder because I could include what happened to so many other people. But at a certain point, you don't want a book to be, and then this happened, and then this happened, and it was terrible. And here's a new person, and they also had a bad time. So, like the person who you mentioned, who's in the introduction of the book, who has this reaction to getting this job offer from Ray Dalio. I follow him throughout the book. He's in the epilogue too. So,
How much of the leaning into the human stories and really understanding the impact that Ray Dalio and Bridgewater had on their lives was part of this is just good storytelling? And then how much of it was you thought it was a way to reach a broader audience? Because I would say, like, if I told my friends, hey, pick up this book about a hedge fund, and maybe they've never heard of Ray Dalio, they would be like, eh. But like literally, I was telling them, man, this is crazy management style. We all have bosses. Like, pick this up. So how much were you thinking about like kind of that wide appeal?
Well, first of all, I won't shock you who knows me, but I do have a commercial outlook on this. I didn't want to write a book that was just like intellectual and that nobody really picked up. What was funny was that when you write a book, particularly a business one, you get a lot of interest from publishers because they tend to be the sorts of people who read the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, so they know the topics. And they're sort of like nerding out on it. So I was really fortunate and had a lot of interest from publishers, and they all knew basically Ray Dalio. They're like, oh, this is going to be like, everyone who read Principles is going to like be shocked. And I was saying, well, only a few million people read Principles, and there's a few billion people who speak English. So I very much thought of it as, I wanted to introduce this to someone who doesn't know anything about Ray or about Bridgewater. But look, and you can do very well writing books. You can make a decent amount of money, frankly, writing books for a business audience. These are people who buy books and read them. So you don't want to ignore that. But I think I did a Q&A once a few months ago at a private club, and one of the questions was, will I learn anything about finance from this book? And I was like, I've read many great books about finance. I can recommend you some. I think you will learn a lot, frankly, but this book contains no information on how to invest or what you should do with your 401k.
No, that's so funny that you say that, because at one point reading the book, I realized there was very little that I was reading about buying and trading stocks. And I was like, what are they doing day to day? But I feel like there was a point in the book where you almost said that's the point, that there was so much of this management style that kind of gave people this busy work to always be looking over their shoulder or, calling out their colleagues. So can you speak a little bit about that culture? So, for people not familiar with Principles or the ranking system, like why that was important to lean into that in the reporting?
Sure. So just if you've never heard of Bridgewater or about Ray, he has this manifesto called Principles, and it starts with when he first comes up with it, it's just a few pages of sort of management rules, and it eventually grows into this multi-headed chimera. I don't know if chimeras do have multi-heads, but we'll all find out later. And it prescribes what you should do at every moment, and it says that this type of person, for instance, a type of person who is open to disagreeing very openly with someone else, that type of person will help you achieve, a higher level version of yourself, will help you know your own weaknesses. So that turns into ranking employees on personality categories, on things like driving through to the truth, or listening, or leadership, or all sorts of sort of nebulous, undefinable categories. And that when Ray describes this, it honestly, even you or I have to say, like, on first blush, it doesn't sound crazy. Like, maybe it would be good if you could just sort of rate me right now and say, Rob, you're doing a great job at XYZ. I give you a 6 out of 10 on that, but it's a 2 out of 10 on listening. You've got to, like, maybe I could get good feedback out of that. And if I trusted you and I knew that there were no stakes, then that I could improve. But there's so much fun at Bridgewater in how it just goes totally off the rails. And people are rating one another on, on the peas in the cafeteria, and there are logs of things that are going wrong. And then people are creating problems or making things up, essentially, so that they can sort of rate their colleagues down on it, and then they can look themselves like someone who is sort of investigating to find the truth. So to me, the great fun of the book, and frankly of the true story of Bridgewater, is that at no point, at no one single point, does any of this sort of go crazy. It happens slowly. Like it's like, ironically, Ray has a principle that mentions this. It's this aphorism that if you put a frog in boiling water, it'll jump right out. But if you put it in cold water and slowly turn the heat up, it'll die. Two great things about that, Jordyn. One, that's not true.
Right.
That's a myth. So right on the face, that principle is bullshit. But it's also exactly what Ray was doing to people. If he had come out from the very start with 250 principles, and people collapsing in the office and being videotaped on trial, crying, I think a lot of people would run fleeing. But he did it slowly over time.
Okay, we will talk about the transparency library, because if folks haven't read this yet or know about this, we need to lean into that. But I also wanted you to explain the bathroom story, like just the level of this has to get done now-ish.
Yeah, so at Bridgewater, and this continues to this day, there's no such thing as a small problem. There's literally a principle along those lines. Ray calls it badness. No badness can be tolerated. So I first heard, by the way, the story you're referencing years ago, and it was so outlandish that I didn't even believe it and follow up. And at any rate, I didn't think I could get it into the August pages of the Wall Street Journal. And so what happens is, one day Ray is in the bathroom, and he is standing at a urinal, which is a phenomenon you may not have experienced, but I think a lot of people have. And he looks down, and there's liquid at his feet. And so a normal thing for someone at a urinal would be to say, I'm in a bathroom, and walk out and never think about it again. But Ray says, this is badness. How can this be tolerated? And he calls in this huge investigation and this trial of what went on in the bathroom. And they're investigating whether the urinals were installed wrong. And he sends an email out to the whole firm. He says, quote, there's piss on the floor. And he makes everyone investigate one another to try to figure out why there's piss on the floor. They're, saying whether we should put stickers so that men know where to aim. They put security guards outside the bathroom to watch after every person goes in to see, if there's liquid on the ground. They make a case study of this. He puts people on trial internally. And to me, the wonderful thing about this story is, everything I just said is crazy, right? But at no point does anyone at Bridgewater, this place of radical transparency and truth, does anyone have the balls to say to Ray, has it occurred to you that liquid might have originated from you, Ray? That you might have just missed yourself? And that is such, to me, like a perfect little microcosm of Bridgewater, that everyone, 1,500 full-time employees there, can be running around at the world's biggest hedge fund, investigating the fact that Ray clearly missed.
I mean, I think when I was reading the book, there's so many incidents like that. Like, wait, it feels like people are running around like chickens with their heads cut off over these incidents. And I'm wondering, like as a journalist, we kind of look for these moments where the dam breaks, where things get so rough that people are like, I need to tell someone about this. This is not normal. And you talked about like there so many things were normalized. So I'm wondering, was there an incident that you read about in the book that was kind of that moment when you started hearing more and more from people like, hey, Rob, this is abnormal. You should write about this. You should look into it. Is there any like story within the book that kind of captures that?
So that's a very complicated question because I expected that moment. I expected to find that moment because you and I know that that's sort of like how you build a story. And there's a sort of a crescendo, and there are many sort of narratives of business that even Bad Blood, she does get caught. And so there's so many moments for me in this book where and in the story of Bridgewater, where I honestly expected someone to do that. And the closest that comes is that Ray's number two, Greg Jensen, who's still at the firm, was sort of his surrogate son. Greg attempts to use the principles in the way that Ray says they should be used. He attempts to use them against Ray to say you're not holding up your end of this bargain, that you're not practicing radical truth and radical transparency. And that is, if I were writing the movie, the moment where something would, break through. His own son surrogate son would be able to speak truth, and instead Ray pushes him down all the way to the bottom. Pushes it down, invents a new principle to punish him, puts Greg on trial. I wound up writing a little bit about this incident in the journal even, and to me that's almost the moment where it gets the darkest, because it's like, oh, not even Greg, not even the number two, not even Ray's favorite can be spared. So without spoiling the ending of the book, Ray is still a multi-billionaire. He's Bridgewater, though it's shrunk a ton, is still the world's biggest hedge fund by some metrics. And I mean, for me, it's the great darkness of this book is that it doesn't have that moment where he is quote unquote defeated.
And as a reader, there's that constant tug and pull of like, oh, he's about to retire. Oh, wait, no, he's not. Oh, so it kind of that also encapsulates the power that he has within Bridgewater. So I know you slightly alluded to this transparency library. So this is more of a question about the research process. For those who don't know, the transparency library, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of these details, it was Ray Dalio and Bridgewater would record meetings from kind of the everyday mundane, but also they would at times put people on trials if they had broken any of the principles, and kind of wanted this group of colleagues to decide, was this person in the right or the wrong? And this was all recorded. So my question is, like, for the process of writing this book, did you watch any of those recordings? Is that anything that you had access to, or was that from people recounting it to you?
So I didn't have access to the transparency library, and I will politely decline to answer whether I viewed any of the videos. What I will say is that these are essentially what other people would call snuff films. They're highly edited, and they're always edited to make the subject look idiotic and Ray to look like sort of like this kind, masterly figure who's just trying to help them. But from a reporting standpoint, they were really wonderful because it took incidents that, mistakes. Jordyn, I make mistakes. You make mistakes. I have difficult conversations. I've lost my temper. Really just once probably in my life, but it becomes limited to who was in the room. But at Bridgewater, because Ray wanted to make an example of people so much, hundreds and thousands of people were able to see a lot of these incidents. So I was able to sort of piece together, and people took notes on them in real time. People, if it involved them, they remember it very, very clearly. Many of them are disturbing, so people remember that clearly. So I was able to piece together, honestly, sometimes better probably than even than watching it would have been, because I'm able to capture what the people watching were feeling in that moment. And I would love nothing more than to see some of these videos. Bridgewater sort of vaguely claims they've been deleted. I don't believe that for 1 second. So believe me, I would like nothing more than for them to play some of these videos and claim that I was wrong. You can imagine why they won't.
Right. And like for those who haven't read the book, there is a cast of characters that show up. If you read stories like finance stories, you recognize names, but then there's names that you're like, wait, James Comey is involved in this? Like, so I think that also really left an impression on me. So I have kind of watched, as your colleague, I have watched Ray Dalio respond to this book. In conferences, on LinkedIn, all of that. So let's go there. I'm wondering, part of this book is poking a hole in this narrative that he has created, in this like kind of narrative that people have of him and perception of him. I'm wondering, when you started this reporting process, and some of it seems like it came through during the Wall Street Journal stories, but obviously in the book, like, what did that feel like to go against the grain of what was already out there about him, from his, origin story to like how the principles actually lay out? Like, how did that feel when you're hitting publish on a story or this book, and it's really challenging the narrative he has of himself?
Well, I would say, first of all, I was not some genius who from the very first second thought saw right through it. Ray spends a lot of time cultivating journalists, spends a tremendous amount of time with academics, and he's really charming. He spent a lot of time with me, and he has a way of listening to you and speaking to you one on one, spending hours upon hours with you. You really can't help but be disarmed, because this is a man who's worth $20 billion, who seems to be spending his whole afternoon just explaining to you his management style. I really challenge any journalist to not at least have some inch of them be charmed by that. What was always so weird to me when I was writing articles for the Journal, and now too, he's done the same thing about my articles at the Times, is he'd go so over the top in attacking me. And I know the sourcing, I know the truth of it, I know that I've spoken to him or his representatives, and he would take something that, frankly, a story that runs on B1 of the New York Times. It's wonderful, but sometimes other things happen in the world. But then he would elevate it so much by attacking it. He would, for this book. So like, I reached out to him in 2020 and asked him. I told him about the book. He was the first person I told after I signed the contract, and he just immediately started complaining and attacking me. And I knew the second that he did that, I was like, oh, this will be something people are interested in. He sort of turned the book rather brilliantly into like the book you're not supposed to read. So in that, I would say this great man who says that he has cracked the code to human nature maybe doesn't quite realize what people want to read.
Yeah, isn't it like within the intro, you say this is the book that Ray Dalio does not want you to read?
Yeah, I think we use that on like every marketing document too. I wanted to put it on billboards. But he doesn't want you to read it, and for good reason.
Yeah. So then how do you so my takeaway from this book, and I just said at the top, I didn't really have a perception of him somehow, despite being a business journalist. It's a name I obviously know, but didn't know the depths of the principles and whatnot. But like when I walked away from the book, there's the feelings of like, wow, that culture is really harsh. It kind of leaves people in its wake. A lot of people had mental anguish, needed time off, all of those things. So, as you were putting the book together, how much do you think about what a reader's takeaway would be?
A lot, honestly, because first of all, I thought of the readers, but I also thought of the people in the book because they're not just characters; they're real humans. The There's a reason why, for instance, you mentioned a mental breakdown. There are a number of mental breakdowns in this book, but there's one person in particular who has the principals push him to fantasize about killing himself, and has to go to a hospital and things of that nature. It's the shortest chapter in the book, actually, um, because I didn't think you needed to know that much to sort of get that point. For the reader, and this look, I take your criticism, by the way, if you don't think I was able to do it, but what I really wanted to do is I wanted people to realize that they themselves could fall under this spell. That this isn't a story about other people who made a mistake. This is about how appealing it is for someone to say, this is how I have been successful. If you just follow these steps and change your personality a little bit, you too could be as successful as me. So sort of at every moment, I didn't want you to be able to say, well, this is Jump the Shark, or this is like, I certainly wouldn't do that. And I think it's the great brilliance of Ray and of Bridgewater that they were able, even though, I mean, people have been calling it a cult for 2 decades now, that even knowing that they were able to continue to bring in more and more and more people by sort of refining this pitch that they were going to help you. If you give up your values, give up the values of your community, of your religion, of your family, and take on Bridgewater's values, you will do better in life. Yeah, David, you can buy the book right now on Amazon. Actually, yeah, you can. Yeah.
So I'm wondering how much you think what was happening at Bridgewater reflects the culture on Wall Street.
Mm. I would go further, Wall Street and Silicon Valley, and the lines are definitely they're blurring. This is a relatively new phenomenon. 100 years ago, ego, not a new phenomenon, by the way. So 100 years ago, John Rockefeller named a university after himself. So it wasn't like, like wealthy people didn't want attention before. But John Rockefeller never claimed that he wanted anything other than that. That he wanted to be recognized as, as a great seeder of men. There's been something new, I think, which is that Dalio and Steve Jobs and Elon Musk, and frankly a lot of finance people, they constantly want to tell you that like they have like cracked the code to human behavior, and it's I personally find it a little disturbing, but I think we have to recognize that it's hugely appealing to so many people. If you just look at even like best-selling books, so many of them are about, here's 5 ways you can XYZ to make more money, essentially. Ray is I think just like the perfect encapsulation of that. But you look at, say, even read the recent Elon Musk book last year from Walter Isaacson. Elon does terrible. I don't want to say terrible. I take that back. Elon does controversial and selfish things that are harmful to people around him. But he says that that's necessary for the greater good. And Walter sort of takes that hook, line, and sinker, and I think we might look at that a little more critically.
And I think often when we think about like workplaces, at least in the past, let's say 6 or 7 years, it's really been this focus on like this power differential. And often we're not thinking about Wall Street in that way because we're like, oh, those people make a lot of money and they do have power relative, to the rest of the population. And so that's what I really appreciated about this book is this deep dive in saying like, hey, even here, this can happen and people can struggle mentally or have to make those trade-offs between, do I keep this job because I have responsibilities at home? So I think, that also goes back to like that human element that you've really brought into this book.
And the money is never, it's always the motivator, and it's never quite enough. I write literally as my career. It's my job to speak to very successful people. And I find that not that they're all miserable, but they all want more money. Very few people stop. In the hedge fund world, it's like a running joke. No one ever shuts down their firm when they're up. They always wait till they lose
Right.
all your money, or they have no choice. There are exceptions, by the way, but generally speaking, and I just like I think it's the greatest kind of journalism you can do, because you're writing about people who are the 1% of the 1% of the 1%, but they are so relatable and fallible, and they have so much influence over our lives. So that's now me encouraging people to become business journalists for the New York Times. But
Everyone should. I was reading our colleague Emma Goldberg's story from last week about how it's really hard for CEOs to step down because they have that power. They have yes men, all this kind of stuff, and it's really hard to be at the top of the world and just step away and give it all
they
away.
don't recognize. Oftentimes, I have found they don't recognize that they're surrounded by yes men. I often ask myself, why do certain people talk to me? The PR apparatus always thinks that no one. I had a funny meeting with someone. A PR person said, "So no one must talk to you now because of the book. Then no one would trust you." I was like, "More people talk to me than ever. Are you kidding me?"
Mm.
But I think a lot of these CEOs, or titans of industry, whatever their title, their whole life is they're surrounded by people who functionally work for them, even if they literally don't. Besides their actual staff, their consultants, their spouse is heavily reliant on them for income. Their kids live a gilded life because of them. They go on vacation and they're richer than most of their friends. One of the things in this book, one of my favorite passages in the book, is a chapter about Ray going on vacation with someone who's one of his better friends. And you can just see this whole vacation. All these vacations are just what Ray wants to do, but they're very cool. I understand why, if I were Ray's friend, I would want to go, diving off a yacht that I couldn't afford. But you have to ask yourself, how often do they have like sort of just a truly equal conversation? And so that's what I try to offer them.
Which I love. I love that insight that, more people than ever want to talk to you. I feel like that speaks to credibility, the honesty with your reporting. And I think one of the vacations that Ray had was like to see a giant squid, but like it never
Mm.
happened. Love that detail. Reminding folks that we're going to do Q&A, so I hope you've been thinking about questions to ask Rob. You can always either drop it in the chat, I can read it out, or just raise your hand and we'll call on you. So as we start getting people asking questions, one thing that I have always wondered is, how does the fact-checking process of book writing differ from our everyday newspaper reporting?
That's a great question, because it's very different. The fact checking process for a newspaper article is me, and you. We're fact checking ourselves.
Right.
Um, as much as it kills me, I paid like a small fortune to, personally, not the publisher, my money, to a fact checker, a professional fact checker, who went through the manuscript of the book, went through
Mm.
every single fact. And thank God, by the way, because he caught a lot of dumb stuff. And then he put every single fact to Bridgewater. He sent it all, and to anyone mentioned in the book. And it was all in writing. So, we could review their responses. That process is supposed to take 2 to 3, 4 weeks, and it took close to a year for this book. It's also it's so much more a book is so much more detailed than a newspaper article, obviously. But in an article, because it's so much shorter, you can get away with just describing things generally. How often in our articles do we say like the sun was shining through the door? Like, we don't say stuff like that. But if I say that in
Right.
a book, I need to make sure it was sunny that day, or I need to at least make sure that the person who told me remembers that it was sunny. Because it's that sort of small detail that then Bridgewater will could have attacked me on. So it's just like, it's so much more, it's like a demented process. It's expensive. The reader doesn't care. Like, no one appreciates it. And even though, yeah,
journalists reading do.
that's true. That's true.
Details. Yeah.
But even at the end of, by the way, having spent all the time and money, Bridgewater hired, or Dalio, they had 4 different PR firms and 3 different lawyers. The last PR firm sent this big dossier about me out to people that included claiming that I admitted to making up quotes. It was like a literally insane thing to say. But I was like, okay, you can accuse me of a lot of things, by the way. I might even be guilty of smarminess, among other, violations. But like, I was like, we did the opposite of make up quotes. Like, everything was checked so hard, and they know it. So
yeah, and as a journalist, like number one, making up quotes is like absolute no. So of course,
that's like a wild.
Yeah, super wild. I see that there's questions. Okay, so here's a question for you. People have their own self-serving reasons for talking to reporters and authors and might agree to be interviewed to try and influence the narrative. So how do you navigate that and avoid being conned by sources to get as close to the truth as possible?
I think implicit in that question is that that's a bad thing. People, you're right, absolutely. People have their own motivations. The subject of a story has their own motivations too. I think you have to be a maximalist, first of all, and just talk to as many people and be honest. Hope to suss out, whether they're aggrieved. I would say just because someone is aggrieved doesn't mean that they are wrong. In a story like this, and generally, honestly, just in covering finance, I find that people lie a lot less than you might think. They don't tell you everything you want to know, but they obfuscate more than they actually flat out make up scenes. And look, I try to be honest with the reader about the motivations for people who spoke to me. But as a journalist, I will say I think we spend way too much time thinking about what the subject is saying and what their PR people are saying, and we should spend much more time thinking about the reader and about the other people who are speaking to us, because everyone has biases.
I think that's a great point that you just mentioned, and honestly, one of the constant tensions with any type of beat reporting. So how did you like move away from, okay, and this is a different instance, but like the access that you sometimes get from the most powerful people with PR teams and all that, how do you move away and make sure that you're talking to a wider range of sources, and maybe sources who aren't inherently, someone's not going to tell them, hey, you should be speaking to Rob right now?
Look, I have a story that will publish this week, hopefully in the Times, that involves a level of access, but the access is from someone who I've known for a long time, who knows that I'm a straight shooter, and that I haven't, not everything I've written about that person has been positive by any stretch. So I do think just being like direct with people is don't kiss anyone's ass. And honestly, it's part of my job to go around the handlers. I always get people's cell phone numbers. I call them, I text them. Maybe they don't talk to you immediately, but they do tend to. It pays dividends 6 months down the road when they realize they have your number.
Yeah. We have another question, which kind of leans into something I was going to ask you. So for the journalists or reporters who might be on the call and one day want to write a book like you, any hot tips on how writing books is different from writing news stories, and anything you wish you would have known before you embarked on this journey?
So much. Oh my God. First of all, I got the worst advice from another author at the very beginning of this process. Someone told me it was just like a long newspaper article. That is such a lie. It is a long newspaper article ends at some point. The first thing I would say is be in love with the subject, because you're going to live it for years. You don't do it for the money, because the money is not that good. And relative to the time, it's certainly not good. I think it's one of the best things I've done in my professional life. But I had to actually enjoy it. I will also say I got really good advice. I guess I didn't ask him for permission to name drop him, but I will do it. John Meacham, who's a sort of presidential biographer and Pulitzer Prize winner, of which I'm not, told me that a book cannot begin with someone's birth and end with their death. There has to be a purpose to a biography that isn't simply a Wikipedia article. And I think I have read books, even from reporters who I really admired, who I think are great reporters, who I think didn't quite understand that you have to be taking the reader on a journey that is about something besides, and then this happened.
And I think I can't remember who told me this, but just as a reminder with books, like it's hard sometimes as a book lover and a book reader to remind yourself that books are a big investment of someone's time. And if they're not inherently like a book reader, like to pick up something that's 200, 300 pages is a lot of time. And so you need to give them a reason for why they're sitting here with you and going on this journey. So it's
I've almost never read a book that I didn't think could be shorter. Could I be honest? Maybe Liar's Poker, like, and I, by the way, I include my own book probably in that at this point now, a few months out. But yeah, you're asking someone to take 10 to 12 hours of their life. That's longer than the original Lord of the Rings trilogy. So, like, it's a great deal. I think it's one of the great bargains in entertainment. But you're absolutely right. Sometimes I see these books about. We're talking about business journalism here, but I see these books about certain companies, and I'm like, who the hell wants to spend 12 hours reading about CVS? There is no book about CVS, but we all have a book in our head that we're thinking of there. Yeah.
Okay, checking that off my list of.
Yeah, there you go. See, oh my God, I'm talking to the
Does a
retail
reporter hurt you? We have another question in the chat. Has your book led to any kind of meaningful change at Bridgewater in terms of their management practices? Or has the book caused other firms on Wall Street or management experts to reassess their views?
Good question. I'm going to answer it in a way that my lawyers want me to answer it, but there will be, an Easter egg of an answer in there. Certainly only Bridgewater could answer why they make certain changes. I will say that since the book is published, the last stat that I had when I finished the book was that Bridgewater managed somewhere in the range at peak in 2022, I want to say, about $160 billion. They now manage, according to Bloomberg, about $80 billion. So there's been a huge asset flow. A lot of clients have pulled their money. And in fact, I've heard from a lot of Bridgewater clients asking me questions about the book. So far as management gurus, I can't look. Ray has people. He pays people like Adam Grant, literally paid, and then they say nice things about him. But I will say it's been incredible hearing from other people in the industry, in the finance world, very high-profile CEOs who tell me they read the book and they can't look at Ray Dalio the same way again. They can't look at Bridgewater the same way again, and they can't. Some of them can't even think about hedge funds the same way again. So every time I hear that, it's really wonderful. I also hear almost every day from someone who either they worked at Bridgewater or their spouse worked at Bridgewater or their friend, and they universally tell me they thank me for just having that angle of the story out there.
Yeah, it seemed like it definitely took a toll on the family or people around them. It wasn't just it just seemed like an all-encompassing experience. Here is another question. Rob, were you able to take time off from your full-time job to work on the book and then for the publicity tour?
That's two questions, so you have to buy two copies. It's nothing if not shameless. I did take a book leave from the Wall Street Journal where I was working. Book leave is like a bit of a double-edged sword because you don't get paid during it. They just hold your seat for you. So I think I took 5 months off. So part of what the publisher paid me for the book went to just cover my salary. I think it's almost impossible to do without. Our colleague Gina Smialek. Let me not exactly.
You got
Let me
it.
not.
Gina Smialek.
Gina Smialek. We'll clean that up in post, right? But she just took like 2 weeks off to do a book, and I don't know how she did it. She's like a superhuman. I will say, so I took the week off for the book, when the book launched. So much of promoting a book and getting people to pay attention to it is, you have to do it yourself. You have to get in front of people. I just I pulled on my entire network, and look, it was a New York Times bestseller and probably the hardest week of the year against Britney Spears, against Barbra Streisand. Believe me, I'm thrilled.
Man, I didn't realize it came out this same week. That is impressive. It's a great book regardless, but that you're up against some tough competition on that one.
This is getting boring maybe to some people, but something like half the books sold all year are sold in November and December. So they backload all these releases into November and December. So you're inevitably coming out against these like celebrity memoirs. I like I walked into bookstores and I saw it not next to Barbra Streisand, whose book, by the way, is like 900 pages. Speaking of commitment, but it's like in the same range. So I like the idea that anybody who would have walked in for that book would have said, "Oh, we'll just throw this basically like pamphlet on top of it."
Rob Barber.
Yeah.
Yes, as a retail reporter, that makes sense because something like 25, a quarter of the sales like Barnes and Noble is done in those 2 months.
There you go.
Okay, so you were already giving some book writing advice towards the end. So someone asked, I'm working on a biography now. One challenge is that my subject is over 80 and having health issues. Are there proactive steps as an author, or is there proactive steps an author can take to ensure their project will remain viable if the subject dies along the way, or the subject's role undergoes a major change?
Well, first of all, I would say take a look at the book I mentioned before, the Jim Simons book, which is now a huge bestseller after he passed away, and that book is like three years old. So I wouldn't say that the viability of the book is reliant on that. In fact, I would say if you are relying on the person being important when you publish the book for the viability, I would think again about the angle of your book, because a book is not a newspaper story. And it should endure a little longer than just when the person's in the news. I will say that an older subject is a double-edged sword. It's good because when they're older, their friends are older, it's sort of like, well, you want your story to be told a little bit. But obviously people pass away and their friends pass away. What I would give an absolute, what you just must do is something. I had a research assistant who's amazing, Abigail Somerville, who's now at Reuters. She went back and she read, thank God she did it, every single article that had ever been written about Ray Dalio, that even mentioned his name, Raymond Dalio, Ray T. Dalio. We found out he had changed his name. I didn't even know he had changed his name, and I'm his freaking biographer. And I learned so much more from that than I ever could have imagined. So, and then we called people. We called people who were mentioned in articles from the 80s, 90s, and they had new things to say. So it was like, if I were doing a project on someone in their 80s, I would make sure that I went back and I knew every possible thing about them, and I called every possible person who was still around for any of it.
That's great advice. We have another one here. I think I know the answer to this, but do you think Dalio
retinol? I use retinol and sunscreen every day. That's how I look so young.
Oh yeah, the glow
Yeah.
in your beverage that you're drinking. Do you think Ray Dalio has read your book?
Hope so.
He knows about it.
Oh, he has a lot to say about it.
Yes.
So I don't know how much interest Ray Dalio has in anyone's opinion other than Ray Dalio.
Another one, before we let you go, what did Ray Dalio do differently from other hedge funds that led to such major growth of Bridgewater?
Great question. He is a truly wonderful marketer, and he figured out, and we should give him credit for this, by the way, far earlier than most other investment managers. He figured out that you could sell an investment product that wasn't just about making you the most money or making you, the client, the most money, but protecting you from loss. And he did that far earlier than most other people. He pitched it as a quantitative program, a program that wasn't just about one man's decisions, that was genuinely path breaking in the 80s and 90s. And he's just a great, charming figure. And he raised money from sovereign wealth funds before that was trendy. He just, honestly, I was in awe even just reading about what he had done in the 80s and 90s and mid 2000s. The great irony of the story is that Ray Dalio was a billionaire, was an unquestioned success before he ever came up with the term principles, before that ever came out of his mouth. And it was coming up with the principles that only a few years later, Bridgewater enters essentially a performance dive that it has yet to recover from. So it's like if he had just been happy with the incredible success he had built, I wouldn't have a book.
Mm. Well, I, for one, am very grateful that you did invest your time in writing the book, that I invested my time in reading the book. And thank you so much for joining us and letting us pepper you with questions. This was really great and informative. So thank you so much, Rob.